Well, hello and welcome back. My name is Ripley Atkinson. I'm the Australian Meats and Livestock Manager for StoneX based in Sydney, Australia, where we're developing price risk management tools for the Australian livestock industry to help the sector manage market and price volatility with our Australian feeder cattle swap. This week, with the early January announcement on imported beef from other countries around the world that supply China, and those tariffs, 55% tariff China placed on those countries when they reach their import quota limit, that situation reverberated around global beef markets. It certainly has made its presence very much felt here in Australia. And today I'm going to examine what the future might hold because of that announcement. Australia is the second largest beef exporter in the world, and I'm going to have a look at how our market share dynamics are going to be affected or how they might shift in the face of this announcement from China and the results and implications of that in countries we supply. I think to start, though, what I would say is Australia has a really unique value proposition relative to its competitors around the world. We're a highly diversified export operator. Our market mix is very unique in the sense that we're not concentrated on other countries such as Brazil is with China on one market. We ship to an array of different countries. We ship an array of different products, and it places us in a really healthy position. When we look at the dynamic of the announcement and what it means, Australia and Brazil were the two countries to receive what could be perceived as the worst outcome, whereby both of the quotas that we received were far lower than the volumes we shipped in 2025. The difference is for Brazil, China is by far and away the largest market of which Brazil exports beef to, over 50%. Whereas in comparison, Australia only shipped 19% of its total beef exports into China in 2025. That is a challenge for the Brazilians, but I think it also is a reminder to Australia that with Brazil now being the world's largest exporter and beef producer, we have two challenges to face. The first one is how this export mix is going to have to readjust, particularly as volumes that were planned to go to China are going to have to be lower. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean simply because this tariff has been placed upon Australia once volumes hit quota limits that exports to China are going to stop. They're not going to stop. We're going to continue shipping beef, and that tariff rate will be absorbed throughout the supply chain. But there will be a displacement of product, and that needs to find a new home. The second one, which is probably more important, is Brazil's quota limit to China is 1.1 million metric tons for 2026. Likely that quota is going to be reached in the middle of this year, June, July, August, is the market's expectation. Once that does happen, the question becomes, where does the Brazilian product go? It is extremely likely that the Brazilian exporters are going to turn their attention directly to the US market, which again is also highly lucrative, and Australia competes head on at a manufacturing level for grinding meat in that US market. Now, there is a multitude of factors which could change between now and then, but they're the two standout issues that I see which are important to recognise. I also think it's important to understand where Australia sits in the global standings and what its recognition is in global markets. The first one is the reputation of Australia as a brand, also the reputation of its exporters and the reputation of our product. Our competitive advantage, because we've been exporting for 50 years to some countries, South Korea and Japan, a good example, it places us in a really good position. We're a trusted high quality supplier of beef, particularly grain fed beef into those high value markets, such as the countries throughout Asia. And that is a really unique position and value proposition which Australia has. Now, this is not to discount the quality of the Brazilian product, but it is to recognise the quality and the reputation of Australia, and that reputation has been created over a long period of time. Now, at a grain-fed level, we are recognised, particularly when the US situation with its own herd is diminishing domestic beef production, Australia is recognised as the only equivalent supplier in the world that can deliver that level of consistency and that high quality grain fed product. Now, Brazil can't do that to the same extent or the same level. That is important for us because it allows us to pivot into other countries. And I think we're going to see some real value and some stronger relationships developed, particularly in places like the United Kingdom and the Middle East. They're really high value, lucrative, chilled markets that Australia likes to focus on. I think we're going to see some good growth in those markets in 2026. The big players like South Korea and Japan, I do believe they'll continue to take strong volumes of Australian grain-fed product, but the challenge will now become, will it be at the same dollar a kilo price as what China was likely to pay? Now, most likely the answer to that is no, which means revenues generated from sales of grain-fed product this year are likely going to be impacted because product's going to be transacted at a lower dollar a kilo price than what we would have seen if the beef were to have gone into China. But Australia is placed in a really positive position because we are recognised as that good grain-fed supplier. Now, the challenge this year for Australia, particularly in the second half of the year, when it's likely that Brazil will have filled its 1.1 million metric ton quota with China, so the volume of product shipped into that market will continue to diminish or slow. Where does the remaining proportion of that beef Brazil produces and intends to export between July, for example, and November, December of 2026? Where does that product go? Now, as mentioned, it's extremely likely that the Brazilians are going to focus on the US. Now, this is the challenge for Australia. How does it navigate that complexity and that significant supply pressure from Brazil in that really lucrative US export market? Now, most likely what that means is Australia is going to have to lower its offer prices to trade to compete with Brazil, or we have to see lower livestock prices here in Australia to allow that to happen. It could pressure export volumes for Australia into the US because when we compete at a manufacturing level, the country of origin and the specifics of that type of product doesn't necessarily matter. This is something to really be aware of, and I think navigating this for the beef industry, or Australia navigating this in 2026, is really important. It's going to really define how we perform as an industry and as a market and a supplier globally, and it's something that we'll continue to keep an eye on. Make sure you're following StoneX Group socials next week. The formal release will be delivered for the StoneX H1 2026 Australian Cattle and Beef Market Outlook Report. Now, this report is going to examine all the key production forecasts for the Australian beef industry, the cattle herd size, slaughter numbers, beef production and exports, and then we'll also look at price, supply, the outlook for both of those key challenges and opportunities for the beef industry, and what does this all mean for the sector. That's one you don't want to miss. Make sure you're following StoneX's socials to get access to that report mid next week. That's all from me this week. If you like what you're seeing or hearing, be sure to head to Apple or Spotify and search for the Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report. That's our Australian fortnightly podcast released on a Friday morning, which is where I discuss Australian cattle prices, supply, demand, beef exports, and other factors and matters that influence or impact the Australian beef industry. Make sure you subscribe to that podcast and give it a follow, and be sure to share it with others you believe would be interested in listening to what we're doing. But until next time, thanks for listening, take care, and we'll see you then. Cheers.